This is the story of how 91 people who worked on a single Hollywood film all developed cancer, and how the United States government knew why and said nothing. John Wayne made 142 motion pictures. He appeared on the top 10 box office list 25 times, more than any other star in Hollywood history, won the Academy Award for Best Actor for True Grit, and spent 4 decades as the defining symbol of American toughness. He also died of cancer. Twice. Most people know the broad strokes: the cowboy who smoked 5 packs of unfiltered Camels a day, the lung surgery in 1964, the stomach cancer that finally took him in 1979. What almost nobody knows is that John Wayne's cancer may not have been simply the product of a lifetime of hard living. A single movie, one of the worst films ever made, shot in the Utah desert in the summer of 1954, 137 miles downwind from the most contaminated nuclear test site in American history, may have sealed the fate of everyone who showed up to work on it. That film was called The Conqueror, and this is the story nobody tells. The most miscast man in Hollywood history. To understand what happened, you first have to understand the film itself. Howard Hughes, eccentric billionaire, and at that time the controlling force behind RKO Radio Pictures, greenlit a $6 million epic about the life of Genghis Khan in 1954, making it RKO's most expensive production to date. The man Hughes chose to play the ancient Mongol conqueror was John Wayne, the same man who had defined the American West in Stagecoach, Red River, She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, and The Searchers. Critics called it one of the worst casting decisions in Hollywood history, and the film itself now sits on IMDb with a rating of 3.7 out of 10, widely remembered as one of the worst movies ever made. None of that mattered as much as where they chose to film it. The supporting cast carried genuine weight. Susan Hayward, nominated 5 times for the Academy Award and winner for I Want to Live, played the female lead. Pedro Armendáriz, the celebrated Mexican actor who would later appear opposite Sean Connery in the James Bond film From Russia with Love, played Wayne's blood brother. Agnes Moorehead, beloved by an entire generation of television viewers as Endora on Bewitched, played Wayne's mother. And directing the whole production was Dick Powell, the same Dick Powell who had reinvented himself from musical charmer to hard-boiled detective in films like Murder, My Sweet. 220 people from Hollywood arrived in the Utah desert that summer, and not one of them was warned about what had happened there 13 months earlier. Snow Canyon, Utah, summer of 1954. Snow Canyon State Park sits 11 miles northwest of St. George, Utah. Red sandstone cliffs, sweeping desert vistas, the kind of dramatic landscape that makes cinematographers reach for their cameras. RKO rented private homes in St. George for Wayne and Hayward, and the company settled in for roughly 6 weeks of location shooting. Wayne brought his sons along, which tells you everything about how safe anyone thought the place was. Patrick visited for 2 weeks and Michael stayed for 6, and photographs survive of Wayne himself holding a Geiger counter on set. Accounts from people who were there describe the counter making so much noise that Wayne thought it was broken, while his sons played around the same desert rocks nearby. None of it registered as dangerous, because nobody had told them it was. And here's the thing that makes the story worse. When filming wrapped, Howard Hughes had 60 tons of soil from the Utah location shipped back to the RKO studios in Culver City for interior reshoots, to match the terrain. Cast and crew weren't just spending weeks in contaminated desert. They came back to Hollywood and worked inside a studio packed with it. Dirty Harry. On May 19, 1953, 13 months before filming began, the United States Atomic Energy Commission detonated a 32-kiloton nuclear device at the Nevada Proving Ground, 137 miles west of St. George. The device belonged to a series called Operation Upshot Knothole, 11 separate atmospheric detonations between March and June of 1953, with a combined yield roughly 19 times the force of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. But the one that mattered most for the people of St. George was the shot they called Dirty Harry, detonated atop a 300-foot steel tower that the explosion vaporized entirely, with the fireball reaching the ground and churning 1,734 tons of earth into the mushroom cloud. And then the wind shifted eastward, directly toward St. George. By 9 in the morning, Geiger counters in downtown St. George were reading 300 to 350 milliroentgens per hour, maxing out some instruments completely. A Washington Post report from 1979 citing AEC documents revealed that a single morning's fallout from Harry had deposited 6,000 millirems on St. George, exceeding the AEC's own permissible level for an entire 13-week period in a single day. Dirty Harry released the highest amount of off-site fallout of any continental United States nuclear test in history, accounting for 75% of the total radiation from the entire Upshot Knothole series, which itself accounted for 50% of all public radiation exposure from the entire history of Nevada testing. The radioactive particles that settled on St. George that morning included iodine-131, which concentrates in the thyroid gland, strontium-90, which mimics calcium and accumulates in bones, and cesium-137, which distributes through soft tissue. Strontium-90 carries a half-life of 29 years, and cesium-137 runs 30 years, which meant the ground where the cast and crew of the Conqueror filmed their scenes was nowhere near clean by the summer of 1954. Professor Robert Pendleton, director of radiological health at the University of Utah, later confirmed this directly. Fallout was very abundant more than a year after Harry. Some of the isotopes, such as strontium-90 and cesium-137, would not have diminished much. Much of the film was shot in desert canyons exactly like the ones where radioactive particles collect and concentrate. What the government knew. This is where the story gets darker, and the government's awareness makes it darker still. Internal documents reveal that as early as 1950, AEC bureaucrats had described the communities living near the test site as a low-use segment of the population. Physicists Enrico Fermi and Edward Teller had both recommended in that same year that test yields be capped and that meteorologists choose test dates, and neither recommendation was consistently followed. When 18,000 to 20,000 sheep began dying in the region after the 1953 tests, AEC investigators looked into it, then falsified the reports entirely, issuing a press release blaming unprecedented cold weather and forcing their own scientists to rewrite field documents, stripping out every reference to radiation damage. The pamphlet they distributed to local residents carried the title, Atomic Tests in Nevada, and it told people, to our knowledge, no one outside the test site has been hurt in 6 years of testing. Children in St. George received school recesses to watch the explosions from the schoolyard. A former Army medic named Van R. Rell. Brandon told the New York Times in 1982 that his medical unit kept 2 completely separate sets of radiation reading books, one showing no elevated exposures for the official record, and a second set with the actual readings carried in a locked briefcase every single morning. And if that detail, 2 sets of books to hide the truth from American citizens, surprises you, subscribe to this channel because every week we dig up the history that never made it into the textbooks. AEC scientist Harold Knapp had reported dangerously high contamination levels in St. George, levels with the potential to cause cancer, and the AEC buried his reports. They also made the decision, according to internal documents, not to test milk samples in order to avoid arousing public concern. The government knew. The decision was made to stay quiet. The deaths begin. Dick Powell was the first major name to go, dying on January 2, 1963, of lymphatic cancer that had spread to his lungs, 58 years old, a man who had only recently reached the peak of his directing career. His daughter Ellen Powell later asked the question that nobody in the government wanted to answer. How dare people not be warned if there is some knowledge of even a potential danger? Pedro Armendáriz outlasted Powell by only 6 months. Diagnosed with kidney cancer back in 1960, he had continued working and had just finished shooting From Russia with Love alongside Sean Connery when terminal cancer of the lymphatic system caught up with him entirely. In June of 1963, at 51 years old, he smuggled a handgun into his room at UCLA Medical Center, sent his wife out to lunch, and shot himself in the chest. The man had appeared in a James Bond picture weeks earlier. Agnes Moorehead died on April 30, 1974, of uterine cancer at 73, and here is the detail that should stop the conversation cold. Agnes Moorehead never smoked, never drank, and lived as a health fanatic throughout her life. Every confounding factor that skeptics would later use to explain away the other deaths simply did not apply to her, and yet cancer took her anyway. As she lay dying, she reportedly told her close friend Debbie Reynolds, "I should never have taken that part." And to fellow Bewitched cast member Sandra Gould, her words were plain, "Everybody in that picture has gotten cancer and died." Susan Hayward, 5 Academy Award nominations, 1 win for I Want to Live, a career that had taken her from gritty dramas to grand adventures, died on March 14, 1975, at 57 years old, having developed 4 separate types of cancer: skin, breast, uterine, and ultimately brain cancer. Her son Tim Barker told People magazine, "My mother was pathetic at the end. She was in a fetal position. She had lost her swallowing reflex, she had pneumonia, and she had lost her hair. And then there was John Wayne himself." The Duke and the Big C. A chest X-ray in September of 1964 turned up an anomaly. And on September 16, surgeons at Good Samaritan Hospital in Los Angeles operated for 6 hours, removing Wayne's entire left lung along with several ribs, stage 3B lung cancer, the kind that leaves very little room for optimism. 5 or 6 days after the first surgery, violent coughing ruptured his stitches, his face and hands swelled from trapped fluid and air, and doctors performed a second surgery to repair the damage. Weeks passed before he left the hospital. His agents wanted the diagnosis kept quiet, issuing statements about lung congestion while Wayne recovered. That changed on December 29, 1964, when Wayne held a press conference at his home and told the world exactly what had happened. His words were, "They told me to withhold my cancer operation from the public because it would hurt my image. Isn't there a good image in John Wayne beating cancer? Sure, I licked the big C." That phrase entered the American language and stayed there. Cancer was rarely discussed openly in the 1960s. Doctors would sometimes inform the family while keeping the patient in the dark, and Wayne's press conference forced a public conversation about a disease people were afraid to even name out loud. 17 more films followed that surgery, including the Oscar-winning True Grit, and the fact that he returned to a high-altitude location shoot in Durango, Mexico just months after losing a lung. Carrying an oxygen inhalator through every scene tells you something about the man that no biography quite captures. None of that, as it turned out, was enough. January of 1979 brought what was supposed to be routine gallbladder surgery at UCLA Medical Center, and when surgeons opened him up, a malignant stomach tumor changed everything. 9.5 hours on the operating table, his entire stomach removed. On April 9, 1979, Wayne made his last public appearance at the 51st Academy Awards, presenting Best Picture, visibly gaunt and reportedly wearing a wetsuit beneath his tuxedo to appear heavier. When the audience gave him a standing ovation, his response was, "That's just about the only medicine a fellow would ever need." On June 11, 1979, John Wayne died at UCLA Medical Center at 72 years old, with his 7 children at his bedside. The investigation. Wayne's death prompted reporter Peter Brennan to publish an article in The Star connecting his illness to the Conqueror filming location, a suspicion that had circulated privately for years but never reached a mass audience. That changed on November 10, 1980, when People magazine published a full investigation by Karen Jakovich and Mark Sennett under the title, "The Children of John Wayne, Susan Hayward and Dick Powell Fear That Fallout Killed Their Parents." Jakovich had tracked down cast and crew members and compiled their medical histories one by one, arriving at a number that stopped people in their tracks. 91 of the 220 on that location had developed cancer, and 46 of those 91 had died. Dr. Robert Pendleton, Director of Radiological Health at the University of Utah, received those numbers and responded with a statement that has been quoted in every telling of this story since. With these numbers, this case could qualify as an epidemic. The connection between fallout radiation and cancer in individual cases has been practically impossible to prove conclusively. But in a group this size, you'd expect only 30-some cancers to develop. With 91 cancer cases, I think the tie-in to their exposure on the set of The Conqueror would hold up even in a court of law. 30 expected, 91 observed, 3 times the anticipated rate, counted only 26 years after filming, not over full lifetimes. Harold Knapp, the former AEC scientist, whose contamination reports the agency had buried back in the 1950s, told the magazine directly, "The government definitely had a complete awareness of what was going on. To a trained professional, the information contained in some of their once confidential reports is most shocking." And one unnamed scientist at the Pentagon's Defense Nuclear Agency, upon learning the cancer numbers from the cast and crew of The Conqueror, reportedly said 7 words, "Please God, don't let us have killed John Wayne." What John Wayne thought. One thing gets overlooked in almost every version of this story, and it matters. John Wayne did not believe the radiation killed him. He credited his lung cancer to decades of smoking 5 packs of unfiltered Camels a day, and given his political convictions, that position made complete sense. A man who described himself in a Playboy interview as an old-fashioned, honest-to-goodness, flag-waving patriot, who co-directed the Green Berets in support of the Vietnam War, who served as president of the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, that man was not going to point the finger at his own government. His son Patrick came to a different conclusion, stating plainly in a September 2021 podcast, "Well, as it turns out, it was fallout from the testing in the area, which they didn't tell anybody about, anyone who lived there, worked there, any of that stuff." Wayne's deathbed request, shared by his son Ethan on social media years later, skipped over blame entirely. When he was in bed, sick and dying, he looked up at his kids and said, "Use my name to fight cancer," And that's what we've tried to do the last 44 years. The John Wayne Cancer Foundation fulfilled that wish, eventually establishing what is now called the St. John's Cancer Institute in Santa Monica, focused on surgical oncology and immunology, with its Block the Blaze skin cancer prevention program having reached more than 675,000 young people. The Reckoning. A congressional subcommittee published its own verdict in 1980 under the title The Forgotten Guinea Pigs, concluding that evidence had been suppressed and stating, "The greatest irony of our atmospheric nuclear testing program is that the only victims of United States nuclear arms since World War II have been our own people." Attorney Stuart Udall, a former Secretary of the Interior, filed suit in 1982 on behalf of more than 1,192 plaintiffs. After a 13-week trial producing nearly 54,000 pages of exhibits, Judge Bruce Jenkins ruled for the downwinders in a 489-page opinion, finding the government liable for negligence because officials knew or suspected the danger from the fallout and did not tell the people. That ruling was overturned on appeal in 1987, but the political pressure it generated led directly to what came next. On October 15, 1990, President George H.W. Bush signed the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act into law, and the statute included a formal congressional apology. The Congress apologizes on behalf of the nation to the individuals and their families for the hardship they have endured. Downwinders received $50,000 in compensation, and as of mid-2024, more than 41,900 claims had been approved with total compensation exceeding $2.6 billion. In July of 2025, that compensation doubled to $100,000 per downwinder, a recognition, more than 70 years later, that what was done to those communities carried a price. The full story of John Wayne's cancer is not a simple story about a man who smoked himself to death. 220 people gathered in the Utah desert in the summer of 1954. And the land they worked on had been blanketed with radioactive fallout 13 months earlier by the dirtiest nuclear test in continental American history. The government knew the land was contaminated. The decision was made to say nothing. Dick Powell died at 58. Pedro Armendáriz took his own life at 51. Susan Hayward died at 57, having developed 4 separate cancers. Agnes Moorehead, who never touched a cigarette or a drink in her life, died telling people that everyone in that picture had gotten cancer and died. 60 tons of contaminated Utah soil rode back to Hollywood in trucks so the studio interiors would match the exterior locations, and cast and crew breathed it in all over again. 91 of those 220 people developed cancer by 1983, times the number that should have appeared, and 46 of them died. John Wayne spent his final years asking his children to use his name to fight the disease that killed him. He didn't demand answers from the government that had sent him into contaminated desert without a word of warning. That was the kind of man he was. But when you watch The Searchers or True Grit or Rio Bravo or any of the films across that 4-decade career, it's worth remembering all the people who stood beside him in that canyon, and the fact that nobody thought to tell any of them to stay away. Leave a comment below with your favorite John Wayne film or your memories of classic Hollywood. We read every one of them. And if you want more stories like this one, the history that got buried alongside the people it happened to, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. We'll see you in the next one.